Good evening all, and welcome to our 6th and longest installment yet of Scary Stories in the Snow. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was born in the northeast of Brazil, a region known for its marvelous beaches. I was quite a pretty child, and everyone used to pay attention to me whenever I was out with my parents. Fortunately, my parents always took care of me and never left me alone for a second with strangers, not to mention the fact that our house was a fortress. Just like many houses around here, we had giant walls and fences around the house to keep intruders out. This story took place when I was around 5 or 6 years old, around the year 1995, and I was going out with my mother to the farmer's market downtown. I used to live around 5 to 8 minutes away, and it was morning, and there were a lot of people at the bus stop, including this one creepy woman standing up in front of us. There was nothing really creepy about her looks, but I remember that she was the first person I noticed when we stopped there. I always had a strong gut feeling to what people are up to, and I did not like her when I glanced. She was wearing a sleeveless white shirt, blue jeans, and black shoes. Really 90s. She was looking around as if she was looking for someone, and then she looked back and saw me. It was the only time she gave a glance to my mum. Really quick, and after that, she couldn't take her eyes off me, almost as if I was some kind of prize. Back then, we used combis as a kind of public transportation. Now, for those of you who don't know, combis are a form of community shuttle bus. When this one arrived, my mum pulled my hand gently to warn me that we could go in the car. Before we got in though, this woman ran and passed in front of me to sit in the middle bench, just where we were going to sit. It was okay, we got in anyway, and I sat with this woman on my left and my mother on my right hand side. Until that point, my face was the same. I never spoke, smiled, or did anything different than give this woman a mean look. I did not like her, and wanted to show that I knew she was a problem. But once I sat on her side, she started to grin in a creepy way, and started to bend down, as if trying to talk to me. She began really low, and I ignored her. I wanted to look onto the other side, but I felt as if I needed to pay attention to whatever she could do. I needed to have her in my field of vision. I remember her asking my name, my age, if I liked school, and I remained silent and touched my mum's leg. My mum noticed and told her out loud to stop trying to talk to me. The woman was ignoring my mother and kept trying to talk to me, so my mum yelled, "Wanna talk? Talk to me, bitch," and moved me right to her side, staying between me and this creepy woman. Even with my mother in the middle, the woman didn't stop trying to talk to me, and I remember my mum telling me to show my tongue to her, to try to make her stop. I did the best I could and showed her my tongue with a really mean face, but the grin never subsided from hers. By this point we'd reached our destination, and my mother and I got out of the combi really quickly and started walking hands-on. And this is when the scariest moment of all happened. I had the feeling that I needed to look back, and I did just that, only to find out that the woman also left the combi after us. I saw her standing up in the front of a car, looking at us walking, and then she looked to her left side, which was an avenue. I felt that I had to follow her eyes, and I did it again. And I thanked myself every day that I followed my instincts that day. I found out that she was looking directly at these two men standing on the other side of the avenue, and gave them a kind of signal with her hand and pointed to us. They spotted us in the crowd and started running towards us. I pulled my mother's arm and told her to watch out. My mother told me to run like I'd never run before and to not let go of her hand. I did just that, and I ran as fast as I could with my mum, just as we were being chased by these three strange people. We were done if they caught us. These guys were really tall and fast. One of them a skinny blonde guy with white shirt, blue jeans and a funny hat, and the other one was a muscle man with a dark shirt and also blue jeans. My mother didn't want to stop and ask for help without a police car near us, so we ran as fast as we could between many streets and the main church. We ran about 4 to 5 blocks around the church, and then a police car appeared in the parking lot in front of it. We ran until we reached the middle of the patio, and my mum turned back and started screaming for help. Then the crowd stopped and tried to hold the guys whilst the police noticed, and they came to the rescue. My mum yelled everything that they were trying to do to us, and that the woman was following us. But in the confusion, the woman ran away and the police arrested the two guys. They were known criminals. Meanwhile, a friend of my mother that used to drive combi saw us and offered to take us home. My mother accepted, and we went home without pressing charges. We both thought it was wrong. We both wanted to make sure they got punished for it, but at the time, it seemed like the best decision. We just wanted to get out of there, and it took me weeks before I went out again. A few weeks later, I got really happy that we didn't decide to pursue this further and take them to the police station. Our friend's neighbour called my mum to tell her to watch the TV on Channel 2. It was the local news, and on it, we see the same lady. My mum and I sat to watch it, and there was the same woman arrested for trying to kidnap a kid in a city nearby, with two other giant scary guys. In the end, they mentioned she was a known member of a kidnap chain that sold children's organs on the black market, and sometimes sold children to foreign families for adoption. I got happy because these people could never have access to our documents because we never pressed charges. Never underestimate the corruption of officers. And I'm so glad that they will never be able to find me again. So creepy woman, let's not meet. Earlier this year, when our exams had finished, my friends and I decided that we would go clubbing to blow off some steam and to celebrate. The club we decided to go to was one with 3 floors, with each floor playing a different style of music. So as usual, as soon as we were inside, we decided to split up. As it was post-exam season, the club was packed to capacity, so even though a few of us headed to each floor together, we soon got separated. I'm not sure how long I had been dancing for, but eventually, it was so hot, I felt as if I were going to pass out. So I began elbowing my way through the dancing swarm, towards the air-conditioned seating area near the back of the 2nd floor. Obviously, no actual seats were free, so I just stood in the alcove and tried to cool down. One of my friends, Noor, is Muslim, and so for religious reasons she does not drink, and she definitely does not hook up. She would literally only go to clubs in order to spend time with us and dance. That night she had joked that we were the teetotal twins, as I was banned from drinking due to just finishing up a course of antibiotics. I'm a medic, so I know not to cheat, as I'm not exactly a fan of contributing to the rise of superbugs. With all of this in mind, you can see why it would have caught my attention when I saw her being piggybacked by a tall guy with messy light-coloured hair, who was built like a rugby player. I called her name, but obviously, I could have been screaming directly in her ear and she wouldn't have heard me at the club. I ran after them and grabbed the guy's t-shirt, yanking him to a halt. He turned around, and as he did, I saw Noor's head flop back. She was completely out of it. "Is she alright?" I yelled, pointing at her. The guy laughed and nodded. Yeah. She's just had a few too many and passed out." I can't quite describe the feeling that hit me at that instant. The closest I can get is the jarring jolt of panic that rips through you when you wake up in the morning, check your clock, and realize you slept through your alarm. Noor didn't drink. Does she want water or something?" I said. "Nah, it's cool. I'll just take her back to mine and let her sleep it off there." "I really think she needs water first," I said. At this, the guide takes a step away from me and said that she was a total lightweight and how it happened all the time. "It's alright. She's my girlfriend," he said. I just stared at him for a second and wondered what the hell I should do. I knew I couldn't fight this guy as he was about 3 times my size, but I sure as hell wasn't going to let him take my friend anywhere. But in the time it would have taken me to explain what was going on and ask for help from strangers, he'd be gone, and probably have taken Noor with him. I tried to stall him for time. "Listen, mate, I'm a medic, and she looks seriously dehydrated. Why don't you sit down with her for a second and I'll go get a glass of water?" "I only live round the corner. It's cool," he replied. "Let me just try and wake her up before you leave, okay?" He hesitated for a second, but finally nodded, and together we managed to persuade someone to move, so that he could set her down. "Wait here, okay?" He just nodded. I set off as though towards the bar, but as soon as I was obscured by the crowd, I made a beeline for the entrance to the 2nd floor, where I knew there was always a bouncer on guard. I tried not to sound completely hysterical, as I yelled over the music to him that my friend had been drugged, and some guy was trying to kidnap her. He told me to calm down, and looked at me as though I were completely insane. Screaming, "I'm sober," at someone is probably one of the least convincing things to say, in order for them to believe what you're saying is true. I was in a panic, as I realized I shouldn't have left Noor alone with that guy. "Please just come with me." Something must have gotten through to him, as he decided to follow me to check it out. When we got there, Noor was slumped forward, exactly where I had left her, and completely unconscious. But the guy was nowhere to be seen. I gave the bouncer the best description I could, but considering the lighting, I wasn't able to make out much more than the hair, his t-shirt, and the fact that he was 6 foot tall and hench. He could have been anyone, and he's still out there. The next day, she woke up with a splitting headache and only fuzzy recollections of even going out that night. She has no idea what happened, no idea who the guy had been, and no idea how to thank me for saving her. If you see a girl who looks completely out of it, or utterly shit-faced, being carried out of a club, or leaving a club with a guy, I don't care how silly or cock-blockery you feel, please, please, just take a second to make sure she's okay. So, I grew up in Las Vegas. I'd moved there when I was in 2nd grade. I was around 7 or so, and my mother was working at some sort of motorcycle repair shop in Arizona that just wasn't paying the bills at all. So, she jumped at the offer of a new job. Fast forward about 5 years, I'm in middle school, and my brother and I were almost exactly 2 years apart. I was about to turn 12, so he was around 10 at the time. My mother, being quite low on the seniority list, was forced to work late nights. That left me and my brother home alone after school more often than not. Our nights were usually pretty uneventful, usually consisted of us avoiding whatever homework we were assigned, warming up leftovers in the microwave, and watching whatever sparked our interest on TV, which was either WWE wrestling or some kind of cartoon. We usually ended up in bed before our mum got home, but occasionally we'd wait up for her. One night, or I suppose one afternoon considering it was still light, everything was pretty normal. My brother sat on the living room floor, engulfed in whatever was on the TV, and I was using my mother's desktop computer, leveling up my character on RuneScape. Then there was a rather aggressive knock at the door, which was very odd. I was sort of an outcast child. I didn't have too many friends, nor did my brother. Not only that, we lived in what you would consider a senior living community. My mother was the youngest adult there, and was around her mid-30s. My brother, being too short to reach the peephole, doesn't move, only slightly reacts and looks at me. I get up off the computer chair and make my way to the front door to glance out the peephole. I see a man in a black ski mask staring at me through the peephole. It definitely didn't seem real. It sort of seemed like something from a cliché movie, as if he were dressed to rob a bank. I was immediately scared shitless, and I obviously didn't bother asking who it was. I silently stepped away, shut off the TV, grabbed my brother and our small black Pomeranian, and ran towards my bedroom. Once we were safely hidden in my closet, I informed him of what I saw outside. He didn't say much, but was visibly shaken, and just quietly stood there holding our little dog. I slid the tiny flip phone our mum lent us for emergencies from my pocket and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator the entirety of the call, and I didn't think the man had left considering the knocks persisted after we left the living room. Yet somehow, she understood me and sent an officer over. Immediately after the call ended with the operator, I dialed for our mother. I explained everything to her, and she ended up leaving work early and came home around the time that the police had as well. I'm not sure what deterred him of pursuing further, but of course, the man was gone by the time they both had arrived. The officer was very clearly not taking any of it seriously, most likely thinking that these two young boys were just paranoid from staying home alone. It was probably just a young man playing a joke on a friend, they thought. However, like I stated before, we live in a senior living community. Who could he be possibly playing a joke on? His dear grandmother? He then gave my brother and I stickers, as if that would console our nerves after seeing some masked man pounding on our door. Fortunately, I never saw the stranger after that. However, after the experience, my house did get broken into, as well as my car 3 times. Thankfully, none of us were present when any of this took place, since my family and I moved out of the state and installed a security system. Nevertheless, I hope we never meet again. I was 16 years old when this happened to me. I am a female. It was just me and my dad in my house, and since he's a businessman that travelled frequently, I was left home alone quite often. First of all, I'm going to try and best describe to you the layout of our house, so that you can better understand my situation. My house is pretty small, since it is just my father, my dog, and myself living in it. There's a long hallway full of full-sized windows, separating my father's room and my own. Our dog loved to look out of these windows, so we always kept them open enough for her to look out of. I'm in the last room at the end of the hallway. In between the 2 rooms is my bathroom and spare bedroom. The rest of the layout is irrelevant. It was around 11 PM when the worst night of my life began. My dad was passed out in bed after a long day, and I was mindlessly dancing around my house getting ready for bed. I hopped into the shower, not knowing what was coming next, and of course, like a cringeworthy horror movie, my dog starts aggressively barking up a storm. With my excessive knowledge of how these things turn out for the girls in the movies, I go out to explore. I head to my room to throw some clothes on whilst my dog is still shitting a brick. Months before, I'm not sure how, I managed to break my door handle, so you no longer have to twist the knob to open it. All it needs is a small push. Scared shitless, I barely managed to put on a shirt when my dog opened the door. I looked to see her enter my room whilst in the midst of barking, and that's when I saw it. There's only one window that has vision to the opening of my room, and in the corner of it, I saw a face so seemingly sinister that I can still see it years later. It was dark, so I took a second to comprehend what I just saw, but when I finally realized it, I screamed. My father owns a lot of guns, so when he heard me scream bloody murder, he ran out with a pistol, and he asked me what happened, and I could barely express what I saw. He ran outside to see the man was still near. We stood out there for a minute scanning the area. A man was casually strolling towards us from the opposite direction about 100 yards away. I knew it was him. I got that feeling in my stomach that you can't mistake. It was as if he was trying to cover up where he'd been by coming from a different direction. That bastard didn't fool me though. You better stay the hell away from my daughter. Do you see what I have here? Do you know what this does? My father yelled, holding up a gun into the air. I swore he could have shot. The man brushed off these threats easily. Go die in a hole, you old man, he said. My father then went back inside and went back to bed as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't sleep a wink. I kept thinking he was going to come back and hurt me because of the threats to him. We called the police next morning, and they came and scoped out our house. They looked around the house trying to calm me down, but I was still pretty shaken up. He went to the front yard first, and that's when he saw it. In front of the windows in the long hallway, there were small bushes, and from this window you could see my room very clearly. If he tried to tell me the news without making me more upset, he failed. There were indents in the dirt right in front of the window. That meant that he knew he needed to look there, and it seemed like he had been here more than once, because of the broken pieces of bush and the divots on the ground. Turns out he was our old neighbour's nephew, and he'd been staying there for a few months. He was never arrested, never got in trouble, and probably got barely more than a slap on the wrist. But at least he's gone now. How long had he been watching me? I'll never know. All I know is I keep my door shut, and I never keep the blinds open. So creepy nephew that had been watching me for God knows how long, let's not meet again. Here's a little background, so that I can explain my experience a little better. When I was younger, I had a great-grandmother that used to babysit my cousin and I. This woman was evil. She was so horrible to me. She used to tell me how fat I was, and when I got hurt, she would never comfort me. However, there was one cousin that my great-grandma absolutely loved. She never hid the fact that my cousin Jean was her favourite. I can remember when my great-grandmother passed, I never cried once. My cousin Jean, on the other hand, was a mess. 20 years in the future, I headed up to visit my cousin Jean. I arrived at her apartment and unpacked my things in her room. I looked at the photos on her dresser, and there was a picture of my great-grandmother. I have to admit, I looked right at it and gave a snarl. After all those years, I still have bad feelings towards this woman. My stay was awesome, and the last night there, I got up from my sleep to use the bathroom. All the lights were off, except for a couple of night lights lighting the way to the bathroom. When I got to the bathroom, I didn't want to turn on the light, in fear of waking up my cousin. As I'm sitting on the toilet finishing up, I had the sense that there was something in the hallway watching me. I didn't see it, but in my mind's eye, I could see this creature hunched over on all fours. It's hard to explain, but I could tell that it was female. It just stood there staring at me. I had a sense of total fear. I flushed the toilet and washed my hands and ran down the hallway to my blow-up mattress and got under the covers and closed my eyes. As I lay there, praying I would fall back asleep, I felt the corner of the blow-up mattress slowly move down. It was as if something was kneeling on it. All of a sudden, something grabs my arm, and I feel a surge of electricity shoot through my body. I was completely paralyzed. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed for it to go away until I finally slept. I woke up super early that morning and decided to head home. I was so traumatized by the experience. I just wanted to get away from the apartment. I finally got home and called my cousin to let her know that I'd made it safe, and asked her if she ever had any paranormal activity in the house. And she told me that she'd never experienced anything, that she's always felt quite at peace in her home. I feel in my heart it was my great-grandmother making a special guest appearance. It was payback for snarling at her picture. A year later, I went back to visit my cousin. She'd bought a new place, and my mother and I wanted to visit and stay there. My mother and I unpacked and got comfortable in the room. After I sat down, I was looking around the room, and I spot the same picture of my great-grandmother. Instinctively, I snarled at it. You know, you'd think I'd learned my lesson from the first time, but I really didn't like that woman. The snarl really came out of habit. The next day, my cousin, my mother and I go shopping. We were gone for half the day, arriving at my cousin's house. When we were all walking through the front door, my cousin was the first to enter, followed by my mother and then me. When I shut the door behind me, the couch pillow went flying off the couch. My mother turned to me wide-eyed, mouth open. I shook my head and actually laughed. I knew it was my great-grandmother, letting us know that she was still there, and she was still unimpressed. High school for me was extremely bad. It would have been fine if it were just slight name calling, or just being pushed around every so often, but it was a whole lot worse than that. Here is a little bit of background about my school. I live in an extremely popular tourist area with over 1 million tourists each year, with a local population of less than 10,000. My high school was considered outside the city limits and was considered a country school. The reason for this being that local business owners who didn't even live in the same state had to push back city limits to avoid the city taxes. And because it was considered a county high school, it lacked funding, with way too many students. Even in the last year, people still have to carry around books, not computers, to all their classes, and around 80% of the students came to my school from other schools because they had been kicked out and refused to take them back. A lot of them were convicted felons. This resulted in terrible students with teachers who are not paid enough to care and oftentimes did things that they really were not supposed to do. My sophomore year of high school was the worst. I got beaten up every day, people stole my things, and I was pushed around by everyone. I remember in a particular class, 2 kids pulled out knives and threatened to cut my throat. I told the teacher, who replied, "I'll deal with it in a minute." I ended up having to run for my life and call the police. Other things that happened to me during the year included getting stabbed twice, being shot at once, ran over by a car, and pushed off a 2.5-story balcony, and people trying to beat me to death on 3 different occasions. They're all very serious, and I could go on, but I don't want to drag it out. I hope this gives you some perspective into just how awful this school was, with not a trace of caring about what happened to its pupils. As for the actual story, at the beginning of 11th grade, I met a guy called Aspin. Aspin was also picked on, just like me, along with 3 other kids nicknamed the Star Wars Kids. We were all picked on for no known reason. The 5 of us had sat together at lunchtimes for the past few months, and one day, Aspin says, "Wouldn't it be great if everyone here just died?" To which we all replied, yes, because we felt that a lot of these people deserved it for exactly how they had been treating us. We all began talking hypothetically and jokingly about what we would do to the school. But then Aspin took it further. He said he wanted to do a school shooting. We started off by making a list of people we wanted to keep alive, and then Aspin tells us that his father was an avid gun collector, and he had literally hundreds of guns at his disposal, all with ammunition. This started off as a joke, but escalated very quickly. The plan at first was to pull the fire alarm and wait till everybody went outside and then open fire. But we realized that there would be no way of saving the people on the list. After a long time planning, we discovered that we could quite easily lock all the doors from the outside within about 5 minutes, and this meant that it would keep the police out whilst we did what needed to be done, setting free the good kids, killing everyone, and setting fire to the school. We had everything all set to go, but at the time there had been a lot of school shootings happening, and the school decided to add automatically locking doors to all the doors just in case there was a lockdown. After that, we needed to rethink our plan, which was taking so long the end of the year came before we could do anything. For me, 12th grade was the best half year of high school. It had been because by that time, so many people had realized how badly they'd been treating me. I feel like a lot of people started to grow up or stop being dicks, and lots of people apologized to me and expressed that they actually felt bad for what they did, and quite guilty. As this continued throughout the year, and people apologized for things that they had done, I started to feel better and forgive them. Aspin wanted to continue with the shooting, but me and a few of my friends really didn't want to anymore. So I wrote the principal a note telling him about our plan and telling him that Aspin was the ringleader, and a school shooting was avoided. Aspin got arrested, and me and the 3 other Star Wars kids got 3 weeks in ISS. We would have been expelled, but we were allowed to stay on the condition that we never tell anyone about our plan. I graduated high school, and I'm very glad that things ended the way they did, without violence. I was working in Disneyland and dressed up as Minnie Mouse. During one of my first few weeks, I was working at Chef Mickey's one morning. I'm doing the rotation and see a family with a girl who was really sick. Her family were feeding her using a G-tube. She was in a wheelchair and didn't respond to much. She was fussy, so I indicated to the family that I'd pass their table then come back to them. About 10 minutes later, my attendant comes up to me and says that Princess so-and-so would like to see you now. So I go over to the family, and the mother told me that Minnie Mouse was the girl's favourite character and asked if we could take some pictures with her. Of course. So the older brother, a teenager, is filming all of this, and I'm in character with the girl, and the girl smiles. The mother starts bawling and the dad starts crying too. Once I take a few pictures with the girl, I go to hug the mum, who hugged me back very tightly and said, "The doctor said she couldn't smile anymore. Thank you." Then I went to hug the dad, and he hugged me back so tightly and said, "Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to us." There's a difference when the person is talking to the character and when they're talking to you. The dad was talking to me. So I go back on rotation, cursing that I can't wipe the tear out of my eye. The next day I go to work, and the check-in person says, "Do you know where the manager's office is? They want to talk to you." My first thought was, oh shit, what did I do? I go to the manager's office, and he closes the door behind me. "You were Minnie at Chef Mickey's yesterday for breakfast, right?" "Yes," I reply. "Did you meet Give Kids the World family?" "Yeah," I reply. Give Kids called us yesterday afternoon. They wanted to make sure you were personally thanked with a note on your record. Why? The girl had an inoperable brain tumor. It was affecting a lot of her motor function, and her family's wish for her was to meet Minnie Mouse. Yesterday afternoon, whilst they were in the park, they noticed she was getting sleepy, so they went back to their room so that she could take a nap. I'm sorry to tell you this, but she never woke up. She held on long enough just to meet Minnie, and you made that happen. I was offered to speak to a grief counsellor but declined. It's really heavy to know that a child was so close to death, and that they hung on just to meet their favourite character. And to know that you were the reason they felt that they could depart. So yeah, whenever I was having a bad day at work, I would think about this girl and her family, and say to myself, this is why you do this, because of people like her. When I was in 7th grade, there was a new guy that came in. His name was Antonio. We were very good friends, and he was quite friendly with everyone. He was extremely charismatic. He had amazing drawing skills, with a very particular cartoony weird art style. And he wasn't edgy. He was just very anti-religion, and liked guns. A lot. We'd play a lot of Xbox together, and the absolute only games he'd play would be shooters. Halo, Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, Sniper Elite, those were all in his game roster. His dad was from Belgium, but we lived in Costa Rica. And their family did own a couple of guns, which is almost unheard of here. In 10th grade, I moved schools to one closer to my house. But my best friends, one guy and 3 girls, all stayed behind. So did my now wife, but we weren't dating at the moment. So I stayed in touch with most people from that school. Now the principal that we had was famed for being a massive bitch before she got to the school, and her arrival wasn't exactly welcome with open arms, but everyone put up with it in the end. My friend, however, was not very keen on her. There was a point in which Antonio started handing out bullets, or bullet casings, to people he deemed important. He gave these to my 4 best friends, and his recent ex-girlfriend and my now wife. He also had a habit of making a cut in his forearm and sucking out his own blood. The week we started school, he'd kept saying that Thursday was going to be the day, and this kept happening until said Thursday came. He got out of class and walked over to the principal's office. He spoke with her for a few minutes and then shot her in the head. He then ran to a field nearby where he had his backpack and was about to allegedly shoot himself. but he wasn't able to do it. So he just went back to the front of the school, where he sat until police came for him. This was the first fatal school shooting in my country, and it was talked about for quite some time. She died 10 days later in hospital, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. It freaked me out when my mother mentioned that I was lucky I was not at that school anymore, since he openly discussed with the friends how he resented me because I had just started dating his ex-girlfriend. I never knew if this was true or not, but it makes me wonder. Had I have not transferred schools, had this one action in my life been different, would I be here today? Or would I have been his second victim that day? I will never know, but I'm fortunate that I didn't have to find out. I met him one night in a club, and he seemed nice enough. Good looking and friendly. We exchanged numbers at the end of the night, and I looked forward to meeting him again. Nothing unusual. I was 18 and he was in his early 20s, and I spent a lot of time in clubs, so I was comfortable with everything. About a few weeks had passed, and he'd sent me a few texts and we decided to meet for a drink. He offered to pick me up from my house, but as I didn't know him that well yet, I arranged to meet him by the entrance to a hotel, on a main road near my house. We went to a pub. I had plans to meet a friend about 9, so we only stayed an hour, and he took me to where I was meeting my friend. We had a short kiss, and then left. I was glad it was over, as he was actually not interesting at all. Boring, in fact. He added me on Facebook and I accepted, but I didn't think that we'd speak much after that. I was very wrong about this. A month or so had passed, and we didn't meet again until one night out in our town where we met by chance. He told me he couldn't stop thinking about me. I was drunk and foolishly kissed him as we parted ways again. A couple of days later, it says on Facebook that he's in a relationship. At least this meant he wasn't interested in me anymore, I thought. However, it was not long after that he sent me a text that read, "I am obsessed with you." I told him to stop at this point as he had a girlfriend. He passed it off as just being flirty and told me to get over it. For about 6 months after this, every few weeks he would text me. After the first message happened, he sent incredibly graphic details about how he wanted to have sex with me. I deleted him on Facebook and kept asking him to stop. Sometimes he would include naked photos too. Keep in mind that I never got any further than a kiss with this guy. He texted me once about 10 months into our relationship whilst on holiday with his girlfriend, and told me that he wished it were me, not her. Again, I told him to stop. Each time I turned him down. He'd get annoyed and tell me that he'd never wanted to speak to me again. But sure enough, it was usually less than a month. I'd get a random naked picture again or something. All of the messages I could have ignored, but one night, I hadn't heard from him for a few weeks, and I was home alone, as my parents were on holiday. Bear in mind, this is something I hadn't told anyone. Around 1 AM my phone rings, and it's him, so I hang up. These texts followed. Him: "Hey, let me in, I'm outside your house." Me: "No you're not, leave me alone." Him: "I am. I know you're alone. Let me in." Me: "No, leave me the hell alone, I'm not home alone anyway, you're wrong, you don't even know where I live." Him: "I do, I'm outside your house. Your room is the one with the red curtains." Which is correct. Me: "No it isn't, and you've never been to my house." Him: "I picked you up the first time we went out." Me: "From about 10 minutes away from where I live. You've never been to my house." I take the opportunity to look out my bedroom window, and there was no one to be seen. Him: "I just saw your curtains move. Let me in." I ran around the house and turned off all the lights. I don't know why. I guess I just thought it would scare him off. Him, you just turned off all the lights. I know you're there. I was crying a lot now, and the last text I sent was, leave right this second, or I'm calling the cops. If I ever see you, hear from you again, or have any contact with you again, I will call the police. His reply, you don't need to be a bitch about it, I'll go. I didn't ever hear from him again, but the whole thing almost lasted 2 years from that one very short date. I still get really nervous when I see someone who looks similar now. I still don't know how he knew where my house was, or that my parents were away that night, and I can only assume that he'd followed me. I'd been living in my first apartment alone for about 2 weeks. It was a basement apartment, which meant it was cheap, and the windows were right at ground level, so you could see legs and shoes walk by. There were 2 bedrooms. I slept in one with the blinds closed, but the other room's window had some water damage, so I kept the blinds all the way up to let it dry out before maintenance came. That room had nothing in it but spare boxes from moving in. One night, I was asleep, and then suddenly completely awake and alert. Every fiber of my being suddenly on edge. I looked at my phone and saw it was 4 a.m. I lay in bed for a minute before I turned towards my closed window, and then I saw it. A large, dark shadow of a person with a flashlight trying to see into my bedroom. I instantly freaked. I quietly grabbed a small hunting knife and stealthily moved to the hall so that I could see the other bedroom, the one whose window coverings were wide open. As I peeked around the corner, the person was scanning the floor of my bedroom methodically with the flashlight. They were big and had heavy boots and keys that jingled. So, I'm a single girl alone in a shitty apartment, and I thought that was it. I was 100% prepared to take my little hunting knife and fight this guy. My adrenaline was sky high, and at that moment my phone buzzed, and I got a text from a friend on the police who literally asked, "What's going on at your apartment?" I thought, yup, this is a bad guy. He's peering in my windows and is gonna bust in any second now. But then he went away, and I didn't hear from my police friend after I texted him back. I decided to go lie down on my bed and just wait to see what happened next. Not 5 minutes after lying down, someone knocked on the door with incredible force. The panic mounted again. Now, I have no peephole, no safety chain, just a deadbolt. At the very top of my voice, I yell, "Who is it?" I hear a meek voice reply that it's the police. My first thought is that it's a clever plan to get a girl to open her apartment door. I stood there silently before I heard the voice say it again. This wasn't in trouble. I opened the door a smidgen, ready to slam it shut, but then I see 2 cops. One backed away from the door, and one upped the steps. They must have seen my tiny knife or something. They proceeded to apologize for scaring me. They were the ones looking in my window. I yelled at them, and possibly cried a little. The adrenaline finally broke. I got the whole story from my friend the next day. Turns out a fellow resident of the apartment complex had gotten drunk, lost his keys, and broken into his own apartment to go to bed. They thought it was mine, and were confused by the lack of broken windows. At the time, I was completely terrified, but I'm glad it was nothing more serious. Before I was born, my parents decided to move to the coast and open their own little seaside hotel. The first thing to do when they moved in was to clean up all the rooms. So they took half each to speed things up. My mum told me this story when I was little. She was in room number 8 doing some vacuuming when the whole carpet started rippling. When I was little, I didn't think it sounded scary at all, and had just thought that maybe the carpet had got caught on a vacuum or something, and so I never did really think about it again. Fast forward to about a month ago. I remember this old story and made fun of my mum a bit, thinking it was creepy, when it was obviously explainable. She looked confused and told me I must not have understood her when I was little. Apparently, what had actually happened was that the entire carpet had rippled in a constant, fluid wave-type motion, and all of the furniture and herself had been lifted up and down off the floor for about 10 seconds. She then screamed bloody murder and went to find my dad to tell him that they were going to sell the place before it had even opened. He managed to convince her otherwise, but she never went back into that room. It scares more because my mum doesn't believe in the supernatural or anything like that, and doesn't have any other creepy stories other than that one. Just this one, and she doesn't like to talk about it often. I was at a friend's house spending the night when I was in middle school. As expected, we'd stay up all hours, which didn't matter most of the time, except the bathroom was right near his parents' room. About the only time we'd get into trouble would be when someone would wake them up when nature called. To avoid this, we'd go out to the basement door and just pee in the neighbouring woods. The door stayed unlocked most of the time, because we'd managed to lock ourselves out more than once. This was also compounded by the fact that we'd all wander out and find something to do in the woods on a regular basis. This night, his older brother was home and kept barging in on the basement door and raining chaos from above, so we decided to lock the door just to deter him. Not that it really would have been a big deal keeping him out, but at least he'd have had to use the other door and key, and took the barging fun out of it for him. Around midnight we hear the handle jiggle, and don't think much of it, figuring it was just his brother. After about 5 minutes of on and off hand fondling, we finally hit the door and yelled for him to stop. There was silence on the other side. There was no response, but around 10 minutes later, it started again, and the process repeated. This went on for about 2 hours until finally, after telling him to just stop, we said screw it and ignored it. So fast forward to around 9 AM. We were stirring and one of my mates had to go to the bathroom. If you've ever had a sleepover like that, there are bodies strewn all over the place, and once the first person starts to walk around, it kind of stirs the nest. We all started stretching and making our ways to relieve ourselves of all the soda that we'd binged the night before. As we go walk outside, I grab the door handle and close it behind me, and noticed it felt rough. After looking at the space around the keyhole, I saw it was all but destroyed. There were giant scratch marks on every surface, and the metal guides were bent and skewed. I asked my friend that lived there what had happened, and he said that it's the first he'd ever seen of it. Not really wanting to be blamed for something that his brother did, we went upstairs and told his parents about the night before. After his dad went downstairs to see what we were talking about, he went completely white and ran upstairs to call the cops. Evidently someone had been trying to force the lock open whilst we were all inside. That actually happened to me more often than once on different occasions. But what completely freaked me out about this is that this person knew that we were in there, but that didn't deter him, and he kept trying to get in even more. I don't know what kind of person that would be. I was in 8th grade in 1995, and my father received a transfer overseas, moving us to Pakistan. All of my classmates at middle school kept making random jokes that I was going to get shot and killed. Just a few weeks earlier, 4 Americans were killed in Karachi, Pakistan. I moved to Pakistan and things went smoothly. Then one day, when I was in a junior high school, my older brother, who graduated high school in 1993, was visiting and woke me up around 4 AM and told me to go up to the multi-system. We had 2 TVs, an NTSC that played US movies that was hooked up to our Armed Forces radio and television service that was the smaller multi-systems TV that we used to watch news and stuff. Anyway, blurry-eyed, I was not really understanding what I was seeing, and I asked him what I was looking at. "That was our house," was his response. Then it hit me. We were looking at our old house on the corner of Pierce and West Pork Avenue in Littleton, Colorado, with a police sniper on the roof looking north towards Columbine High School on a British news station via satellite in Islamabad, Pakistan. Several of my classmates from Leewood Elementary and Ken Carl Middle School were shot, and at least one kid who had warned me that I would be killed in Pakistan was dead. Not sure if that counts as survival, but it hit close to home for me. My ultra-supportive dad later weighed in on the situation and said, "Hey, most of the kids killed were in the library, and with you being a dumbass, you probably wouldn't have been there." I felt absolutely horrible. My son came running into my room in the middle of the night. He was shaking my arm and trying to wake me. When I did, I was groggy, and it was hard to understand him. However, he seemed very alarmed, and that is what woke me. His name is Aaron, and he told me that there was a girl in his closet with a knife. The sheer shock of hearing such a thing got to me, and I bolted out of bed. I had Aaron stay in my bedroom with his mother. Then I rushed into his room to look around. His room was only lit by his nightlight. I turned the light on and slowly made my way over to the closet. My heart was beating hard. I wondered what might be in there. A little girl holding a knife would have to be a psychopath of some sort, so I figured I needed to quickly open the door. I pulled it open and looked inside. There was no one there. So I went over and checked under the bed. There was no one there either. Not even a killer orange cat. I was still nervous, although I began to think that Aaron might have just had a bad dream. But I knew it was better to be safe than sorry, so I checked out the entire house. No one was there. Not only was there no girl in the house, but there were no signs of a break-in at all. I went back into the room and told Aaron that his room was safe and that he could go back to bed. Scared, he pled with me to be able to sleep in our room. Normally, I wouldn't encourage this behavior, but I told him that he could for one night. The following night, I could tell that Aaron was scared as bedtime approached. I felt so bad, making him sleep in his room by himself. I had to draw the line somewhere. I couldn't have him sleeping with his parents for years. I wanted him to face his fears. So around midnight, Aaron came back into our room. He was tugging on my arm again, trying to wake me up. Again, I was groggy, but realized what was going on. I told Aaron that he must be having a bad dream. I had checked out the house last night, and there was no one in it. I wanted him to go to bed, but he was terrified, so I made him a deal. I told him I would sleep on the floor in his bed for one night to make sure nothing bad happened. So, I went to Aaron's room, and I slept by the bed. The kid was out like a light in a few seconds, and once I knew he was out cold, I decided to close my eyes and get some rest. So I was lying there, on the verge of sleep, and then I heard something. It sounded like the closet door was opening. I shook off the sleepiness and opened my eyes. The closet door was slightly open. Standing in the open spot was a girl of around 12 years old. She had long black hair and was wearing a green dress. But the scariest part was, she was wielding a meat cleaver in her hand, and she was looking straight at me. I jumped, now scared out of my wits, but suddenly, she was gone. I searched the room, and there was no trace of her. It was then that I realized it must have been a ghost. The following day I rearranged the house, cleared out the study and made it into Aaron's room. His room became a study, and I only ever used the study during the day. But every time I went in there, I was terrified, waiting to see if she would appear. I spent the first 10 years of my life in the city of San Jose, California. Where my mother could afford it, she would take me to a theme park in the neighboring town of Sunnyvale called Great America. We went there around once or twice a year. The rides were fun, the food was good, and I wasn't paying, so I had a good time whenever we went. Except once when I was around the age of 7. About an hour or two into the day, I got that feeling. You know the one. When you get the sneaking suspicion that someone you can't see is watching your every move. I mentioned it to my mum, and she said that I was imagining things. We went on about our day and it was fun as usual, but I couldn't shake that feeling. All day it got steadily worse until I was literally begging my mum to take me home. And eventually she obliged, but couldn't figure out what had gotten into me. Now a little backstory. My parents got divorced when I was only a baby. When I was around 11, they reconnected and decided to get back together. Now a little backstory. My parents got divorced when I was only a baby. But when I was about 11, they reconnected and decided to get back together. And so we moved into a shitty little town called Eureka. My dad's father, who I refused to call my grandfather, lived in the same town. I would never speak to anyone, not even my father. He was in every sense of the word a recluse, and he passed away not long after we moved. And my father, being his next of kin, was tasked with going through all his things. The first word that came to mind when we entered the house was paranoid. There was at least one rifle in every room of the house, sometimes 2 or 3. There was a Colt .45 under his pillow, and another under the driver's seat of his car, and a snub-nosed .38 with a Ziploc bag in the back part of the toilet. Cameras were mounted on every exterior wall, and boxes upon opening, full of VHS tapes that collected recordings from these cameras, some of which were nearly worn out from repeated viewings. Suddenly, from the master bedroom, I hear my mum yell, My mum rarely swore in front of me, so I knew something was seriously wrong. And what I saw in my mum's hands shocked me to the core. It was a photo of me and my mother at the theme park. I was around 7, walking along with a corn dog in one hand and drink in the other, and I had a suspicious look on my face. I instantly remembered that day. My mother said that she felt faint and left the room. As it turns out, there were 30 pictures of us from that day, as well as some from other times and other places. Some of them were taken from within arm's reach. I'd never felt more creeped out in my life, and I haven't since. I don't know why he was spying on us, and I'm not sure that I want to. So it was my junior year, and I was sitting in my geometry class waiting for the bell to ring. It was the last period of the day. It was about 10 minutes before the bell, and my teacher had long since stopped lecturing and was sitting at his desk to let us get a head start on homework. When the phone rings, he picks up, converses with the person on the other line for a while, and hangs up. He informs us that the buses are running late, and that we are all to stay in the classrooms until further instructions are given. Oh, okay, whatever. We don't think too much about it. Half hour passes and we're still given no instruction. Finally, he gets another call, and this time we're told that we need to sit down on the floor, away from the windows and doors. Absolutely no one leaves the classroom for any reason. Another hour passes, and still nothing. Whilst most of us are sitting away from the doors, there are a few people who can see out of the tiny rectangular window and say that they see people with helmets walking by every now and again. Time drags on. It's been 5 hours past the time that we were supposed to be dismissed, and finally, there's a knock on the door. A man calls in, saying he's with the police and to open up. He has a gun, and he escorts us through the school and out through the main entrance, where we are patted down and sniffed by dogs, and our backpacks searched thoroughly. Nothing found. We're escorted to the giant field house. Half the school is there already, and there are more kids from different classes filling in. People are talking about how there was a bomb threat, how some kid got shot, or how someone saw someone with a gun. We are detained for another hour or so before we're finally released, and at this point it's around 9 PM. It isn't until a week later, after extensive investigation, that they determined who had done it, and that it had all been a hoax. Because it was a minor, they weren't naming anyone, until one local radio station shouted out the person who did it. And yeah, it was this girl who lived next door who I grew up with. She said that she had been cornered by a group of girls in the bathroom, and that they had shoved a gun in her mouth, and were making all kinds of threats to shooting up the school. She got expelled, obviously, and since there wasn't a school that would admit her within a mile radius, I don't think she ever finished her GED. I see her around sometimes, and I hear she's dating some junkie twice her age. I live in a slightly rural spot, and there are also some known meth labs nearby. One night, after about midnight, I hear banging on my door. I thought it was my boyfriend because he'd called me earlier saying that he may or may not pop round. When I got to the door, I looked through the small glass window, but instead of my boyfriend, I saw the side of an unfamiliar bearded face. He didn't see me, and I backed away from the door. My house was in a cellular dead zone, so I knew that my cell was useless. I grabbed the landline next to my bed to call 911, but the line was dead. It was just like a horror movie, where the killer cuts the phone line. Meanwhile, the guy was still pounding away and slurring, "Let me in." I grabbed the biggest chef knife I own, which is pretty huge, and locked myself in the bathroom. I stood at the edge of the tub, behind the shower curtain, figuring I might have a chance to jump him if I stabbed him between the neck and shoulders when he tried to bust in the door. I was terrified, but also pleased with my plan and waited. He started working his way around the outside of the house. I could hear him sliding his hands along, sliding, and banging his fists along the wall. For a split second, I reveled in my surprisingly badass plan, and then I realized that the sabotaged phone hadn't been charged in days. Maybe one of the other handsets still worked. I have never felt more fear than the moment I climbed down from my hiding spot, unlocked the bathroom door, and went in search for the second handset. All the while, a madman was moving around the outside of my house, violently trying to unlock every door and window. I found a phone, and it worked. I dialed 911, but the closest officer was over 15 minutes away. I was told to stay on the line, but locked myself in the bathroom again. That was the longest 15 minutes of my life. When police arrived, they had me identify a cuffed, scruffy, drunken off his ass dirty hippie kid. Apparently, there had been a party down the road. He got disoriented and thought my house was his friend's house. He was trying to get back inside the party for 20 minutes of pure terror. Moral of the story: keep your phones charged, people. My mother used to be the manager of this old mansion-style hotel that was primarily used for weddings. According to her and the rest of the staff, the place was definitely haunted. Several stories validating these claims stick out in my memory. Something about a chef killing himself in one of the rooms, or the original owner's daughter dying in another. I mean, though this place was very beautiful and elegant, it was huge and several hundreds of years old. So you can imagine that some of these stories weren't very hard to believe, especially since my mum always was working there late and sometimes alone, and had consistently creepy stories to share. The one that sticks out in my mind the most is relatively tame, but absolutely chilling. So one night, after one of the weddings, my mother and the rest of the staff are cleaning up. They did normal things: clear the tables and tablecloths, break down all the equipment, collect the decorations, and box them for the client. Then place all the chairs upside down on top of the tables so that the next day they could vacuum and mop easy. The wait/cleaning staff leave around midnight, but being the manager, my mum has to stick around and close up shop. So, as she's making her way to the back office on the ground floor, she passes the dining room and sees the chairs are still placed on the floor around the tables, despite the fact she almost certainly remembered placing them on top of the tables an hour prior. She goes around the entire dining room, placing them back on the tables, and then proceeds to continue what she was doing before. About an hour later, around 2 AM, she's getting ready to leave, going from room to room to turn the lights off. The last room she has to turn the lights off for is the dining room. So she goes in, gets ready to turn off the lights, and what does she see? The chairs are back on the floor around the tables. The way she tells the story, it was at this point that she froze in a mix of terror and confusion. and she just ran out the building and drove home. My wife was a senior at St. Puys X High School in Ottawa. It was a Catholic school with nuns and brothers for teachers. A guy she knew walked in with a shotgun right in front of the class. The students were just getting in. Then he started shooting. My wife was about 4 from the front, and everyone scrambled and screamed to get to the back. He got 5 or 6 in the front center, and one of the guys got hit straight in the face. He died instantly. She said there was blood everywhere. The teacher was a male brother and moved to get in the way and save the students. She said it happened so fast. Then the shooter moved out of the class, away from the teacher, and blew his head off in the hallway. She said that when he died, they left the classroom and had to step over his body. She slipped on some of the blood, and that his entire face was blown off. She doesn't like to talk about it much, but a few years ago, when we were watching a documentary about Columbine, she opened up. The guy that got killed was a friend, and a few of the students were badly wounded, but survived. One girl lost her eye, I think. She says the guy was a real loner, and raped and killed a girl right before the shooting. Some of the other guys apparently teased him pretty hard. When I was 16, I was home alone. It was a beautiful summer's day out, and my mother's flowers had just started blooming. So, I walked out into our yard to look at the flowers. As I'm standing there, I hear this eerie mumbling sound. I give a shout to our next door neighbour, who doesn't respond. I then shout a bit harder to the neighbour across the alley. Still no answer. I was now standing a bit closer to the wooden shed, which was in the back of our yard. And suddenly it hits me that the sound is coming from inside the shed. I have a minor freak out, but decide to slowly and quietly approach the shed to have a peek through the cutout heart in the door of said shed. The shed is a mess. Stuff is moved aside, and the summer camping tent is pulled out of its packaging, creating some kind of nest. All I can see is a head of hair, and the freakishly scary humming is now even louder. I run into the house and call my dad, letting him know that someone's in the shed. He rushes home, orders me to lock all the doors, and to call the police, and to wait in the hallway where I can't be seen by the person in the shed. My dad arrives, joins me in the hallway at the front of the house, and we wait. So the cops arrive and they open the shed. Turns out it was a homeless woman who was mentally ill and who had decided to camp out in our shed. She had shat all over herself and all over the stuff that we had kept in there. She got sent away, but invaded another person's yard just minutes later, so she had to be taken to the station. A bigger cop car was called in, and both cops were hanging their faces out the window. The stench was that horrifying. I did feel sorry for her though, and everything in that shed had to be thrown away pretty much immediately. This happened when I was working in a hotel as a cleaner in New Zealand. The entire second floor had been shut down. This happened during that time. So the second floor had been shut down, and we had just begun vacuuming and stain removing all the carpets, when suddenly the hand dryer in the woman's toilets on the end starts turning on. You know, the shitty hot air ones that don't dry your hands at all. We go in there, thinking that someone went into the toilet and just took an abnormally long amount of time. As soon as we open the door, the dryer stops completely. We go in, and sure enough, nobody's there. So we leave and let the door swing shut. As soon as it swings shut, the hand dryer goes off again at full noise. I go open the door and it stops again. We do this another 3 times before we get the great idea to have one of us go in the toilet and the other lets the door shut. So I stand in the toilet and she lets the door shut. As soon as the door shuts, I get a massive chill up my spine. The lights go out and the hand dryer starts. I boulder my way out of there and we just left the upstairs that night. Too creepy. I went to a Catholic school, and so we had a school chaplain, who was essentially a sort of friend to the kids. It sounds really creepy when you say it like that, but this dude was absolutely amazing. He talked multiple students out of suicide, helped tons of kids come to terms with and overcome bullying, harassment, and sexual/domestic abuse, as well as encouraging every single student to reach for their dreams. Anyway, he once went the extra mile for a very troubled family at my school. The 2 kids in question were adopted brothers and were both incredibly unstable. The brothers would be your very best friend one second and then suddenly fly off the handle the next, making you literally fear for your life. Anyway, knowing their family problems, the school chaplain volunteered to become the 2 boys' godfathers in order to legally be able to help them and their family out financially. After about a year that I finished school, the school chaplain appeared in the local newspaper. He had been arrested and imprisoned for raping the elder of the 2 lads. For most people, that was enough to condemn him. But most of the people I went to school with found the whole thing somewhat suspicious. Whenever someone encountered one of the 2 boys, they would instantly launch into a step-by-step recount of what happened, as if desperate to convince everyone they knew that they were telling the truth. The only thing wrong was that these step-by-step recounts were usually vastly different each time they were told, as if poorly thought out. Regardless, the chaplain was imprisoned and eventually died of cancer while still inside. It was only after his death that it finally came to light that the rape never happened. The chaplain had run into financial trouble himself, and so was unable to keep giving financial assistance to the boy's family. As punishment, the whole family, yes, the parents were the ones who came up with the idea, invented the rape story to teach him a lesson. The guy was a hero. He even helped my girlfriend at the time get through her parents' divorce in one piece. And yet his lot in life would end up with him sad, forgotten, and alone. When I was little, I was always really paranoid. Even the smallest thing would startle me. One day, I went back from school because I had detention with my best friend Peter. We were always troublemakers, but this time, we had to stay late because we misbehaved in detention, and we had to stay an additional 2 hours longer. We begged the teacher giving us the detention to let us go early, because we had to walk home, but the teacher wouldn't budge, and was a fitting punishment for us not behaving. It was a 3-mile walk back home, and it was already sunset. Being the paranoid kid I was terrified walking back this late, but I knew we had to walk fast because if we didn't, my mum would be back from her job and would know that I had been in detention So we kept a swift pace and started walking to the road home. The normal way to get to school is right alongside the road, with tons of cars and people always driving or jogging by. But there was also a shortcut that led right through a pretty rundown neighbourhood and went through a very smallly wooded area. I hated going that way, but it would shave off about a mile of walking time, so I knew I really didn't have a choice. By the time we'd reached and run down the neighbourhood, it was starting to get dark, and we were both getting worried, but we kept walking. We were almost to the wooded area when Peter pointed out that a man had been following us, and saw a middle-aged man in a stained t-shirt, ripped jeans and covered in tattoos, walking a few yards behind us. Peter told me that we should walk faster, and we did. We didn't look back until we were halfway through the wooded area, and when we did, he was gone. It was now getting really dark, and we were having to use the lights that went along the walkway to see. He walked a few more minutes, and that's when we heard Peter scream. The man had grabbed him by his backpack and began to pull him away. I don't know what to do, so I began screaming for help, hoping that people nearby would hear me. But I knew I had to help Peter. I took out a metal water bottle from my backpack and began hitting the man in the head as hard as I could. He eventually dropped Peter and struck me. It knocked me to the ground and I could taste blood in my mouth. The man then grabbed my water bottle and began to strike me with it continually, over and over again whilst on the ground. Peter began screaming for help, and several dogs started barking from nearby houses. I guess one of the dog owners came to see what was happening. When he did, Peter signaled for help, and the man let his dog loose and began to run after us for help. The man hitting me didn't even notice. He was incredibly angry and kept hitting me in the face with the water bottle. I tried to cover my face to turn away, but he then screamed to just hit me in the head. I remember crawling up into a ball, and then the dog bit the man in the leg. He screamed and I saw blood drip from the wound. Shortly after, the neighbour came around calling, and the man following us ran off. Peter and I were both fine, other than being scared shitless and having a bloody face, broken nose and a big headache. But the police never caught the man, and that's what scares me to this day. After this happened, the teacher that gave us detention was fired for not telling our parents to pick us up, and my mum got a different job so that she could always bring Peter and I back home. I worked maintenance at a hotel in Montana about a decade ago. It was mostly normal shit. Guests were rarely an issue. The job was meh, but I was a broke student at the time in college. Weird shit happened to me when I got stuck with the late shift from 7 PM till about 2 AM. Honest to God, I still can't explain it. I was downstairs in the basement, setting up the big meeting room for some big event tomorrow. I have to explain the layout of this meeting room for people to understand. It was this huge room with 3 doors. The main door that opened into the hallway, the fire exit which locked from the inside, and the kitchen entrance. The kitchen had 2 entrances also, one into the meeting room and the other opening into the hallway. Anyway, that night I had spent all of the first part of my shift setting out this room by myself. 15 big tables, tablecloths, centerpieces, and God knows how many of those metal stackable chairs. It was about 5 hours of doing that, and I was actually pretty proud of my setup and vacuuming the hallway outside of the meeting room. I watched as the kitchen crew closed up for the night and waved them off. Lights out, and it's just me and my vacuum in front of this big ass meeting room. I was finishing up my vacuuming when I hear the unmistakable sound of those metal chairs being stacked. Anyone who has ever stacked or unstacked those chairs knows that weird hollow metal clang. Especially me, after doing it for a few hours. I was a bit pissed. I had just spent 5 hours setting up this meeting room and figured that 1 or 2 of the kitchen staff went into the lounge before they clocked off. Mind you, I'm in front of the main door to the meeting room and the hall door for the kitchen. The only way in or out of this meeting room was past me, aside from the fire door, which you can't get in from the inside. Anyway, I hear the clanking, and I go running into the room with a, "Hey guys, knock it off," expecting to see a cook or two, rearranging my precision chair setup. Instead, I am greeted with no one. The room is exactly as I'd left it. No chairs were moved. No one was in. I double-checked the kitchen, and no one was in there either. I shrugged it off as a trick of my ears and went back to vacuuming. As I finish vacuuming and turn it off, I hear the clanking again. Unmistakable, clear as day, coming from the big room. Again, I stomp into the room and proceed to do a thorough sweep, checking under tables, behind the podium, even in the storage closet in the back. There was no one. I'm getting a bit freaked out, so I just stand in the middle of the room, straining my ears to hear anything, thinking that maybe the noise is coming from the vents outside or something. But there's nothing, just me breathing. I shrug and head back out to pick up the vacuum. Winding the cord, I just happen back towards the main door of the meeting room. Before my head turns fully towards the door, I see someone walking right past the opening inside the room. I freak the hell out. I yelped and ran up the stairs to the main floor. I told management I was clocking out early and went home. Next day, I went in and got a minor scolding for not putting the vacuum away. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I have no explanation for what I saw. I heard the noises clearly, and I saw someone go past the doorway. I asked to be transferred to the day shift after that. Later that year, I quit the job to go back to school. One of my co-workers mentioned that one of the cleaning ladies was telling everyone that the basement was haunted. I don't know. It still gives me goosebumps whenever I think about that night. This happened in the early 2000s. I was vacationing on the Caribbean with my family when I was around 9 or 10 years old. This particular island, like many of the Caribbean islands, was largely impoverished. Of course, the resort communities were where all the tourists flocked to this beautiful slice of paradise. As a young kid staying at a fancy vacation spot, you don't really think about the reality that you're in a foreign country that you don't know very well. You're not familiar with what goes on outside the gated resort, and you certainly aren't aware that, as well as being known for gorgeous beaches, many islands in the Caribbean are hubs for human trafficking and drug smuggling. The sheer sketchiness and what I'm about to describe didn't fully hit me until years later when I was in high school, reading about the disappearances of Amy Bradley and Natalie Holloway, who both vanished whilst vacationing on the Caribbean in the late 90s and early 2000s. One night, I left the resort with my family to go to one of those sunset boat ride sort of deals. We joined another family and took the shuttle to a marina that was maybe half hour away from the resort. I remember as we rode to the marina, I got more of a sense of how destitute some of the less touristy areas on the island were. I saw many of the locals living in small, ramshackle huts made out of salvaged metals that was the landscape of a very much barren desert, unlike the lush gardens that were watered daily within the walls of the resort. The shuttle dropped us off by the docks, and we hit the boat tour. It was an amazing time. The boat's crew pointed out unique wildlife and told us about the history of the island. By the time we returned to the docks, it was pitch black, and probably around 11 PM. And with me barely being 10 years old, I was thoroughly exhausted. I hopped out of the boat and walked along the deck, back to the parking lot where the shuttle had dropped us off earlier. My parents and the other adults who were with me didn't really seem to be paying attention to me, thanks to Captain Morgan and Stella Artois. And by the time they'd gotten off the boat, I was probably a decent 200 feet ahead of them. Now the marina itself was very well lit, but as soon as I turned the corner to the parking lot, I may as well have fallen into a cave. I could hardly see a thing. I squinted my eyes to try and see if the van that we'd arrived in was parked nearby, but after a few seconds, somebody suddenly grabbed my shoulder very tightly. "Who did you come with here?" The voice was scolding, accusatory, and I immediately began to freak out because I thought I was in trouble. "Somebody drove you here." I began to speak to try and explain that I was with my family and they're waiting for our driver, but the man cut me off. "You drove here with me. Here, come to my car." At this point, the guy began pulling me further and further into the dark parking lot towards a vehicle I'd never seen before. I wouldn't even say that I was panicking at this point. I was very confused, and I knew that something was definitely not right about the situation, and didn't want to get into trouble for not listening to the guy. But as he continued to pull me towards his car, I realized that it was too small to fit the number of people who I'd arrived with, and this was when I started to get really scared and pulled back against the guy, trying to break his grip. I was about to raise my voice and start screaming, when suddenly a set of floodlights turned on and lit up the parking lot. My parents and the group of people we were with turned the corner, and the guy immediately let go of my arm. I looked up at him, and I recall that he looked scary. He was bald and had scars all over his face. He was probably in his late 40s. Clearly, he didn't realize that the entire group of people were just 30 seconds behind me. His eyes were wide and dumbfounded, and he had an "oh shit" expression on his face. One of the men who worked at the docks called out and said something to him, but he sort of just threw up his arms and shrugged and quickly walked away. On the way back to the resort, my father asked me what the guy wanted from me, and in my childish naivety, I said, I think he thought I rode in his shuttle, and that I was lost or something, and apparently this explanation was perfectly reasonable, because we never spoke about it again. Anyway, I guess the moral of the story is that if you have young children and like to take them with you on exotic or unfamiliar locations, remind them to be smart and keep their guard up, even in paradise. I worked at Raging Waters in San Dimas, California for a few summers during high school. It was a great job, walking distance from my house, and I got to work on my tan. Anyway, this was the summer of 1987. I was just around 17 and I was on lifeguard duty at the top of the Dropout. Dropout was our huge slide that went up around 70 or so feet and slid straight down. No twists or turns, just straight down into a shallow slip of water. I'm doing my thing, telling people to lie down and cross their arms across their chest, and I would gently nudge them over the edge. It didn't take much for me to slide them over. Literally a slight tug was all it took. Mid-shift, out of nowhere, a group of 20-something-year-olds get into the front of the line. Around 4 guys and maybe a girl too. The one alpha guy of the pack tells me, "Hey, let me slide off myself." And before I could say anything, and I was told by the lawyers that witnesses heard me yell at him to get down, He hoists himself up on top of the horizontal platform of the slide, where one is supposed to lay down, so I can see them slide, and takes a running hop over the ledge. I think he was trying to do a cannonball and land with his back against the slide. At least that's my theory. Like they say, when something bad happens, everything was in slow motion. The guy gets a lot of air. I don't think he realized that the drop was almost 90 degrees down. In midair, he tried to self-correct his jump, his arms and legs wildly trying to feel for anything to grab onto, but it never happens. Thinking about this as I say it, it's sort of like Wile E. Coyote when he runs off a cliff and for a split second or two, he hangs there in midair, realizing that he's screwed. Somehow he free falls between both slides, as Dropout has two identical slides about 2 feet apart, and hit every iron crossbar that held the 7-story deck. The guy falls about 70 feet, hitting pretty much every steel girder on the way down. He lands at the base of the slide, with just about every bone in his body broken, compound fractures everywhere. He ended up in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, and settled for about 1/10 of what he tried to sue us for. Yup, that arsehole tried to sue the park, and me. Luckily there were dozens of witnesses who saw and heard me yelling at the guy to get off the slide. I was also told by management that this guy was absolutely loaded. Either way, I still feel sorry for that poor asshole. In my sophomore year of high school, my friend was murdered. Going back, freshman year when I was in homeroom, I became friends with the girl who sat in front of me. Her name was Deanna Wright. We came from the same neighborhood and both worked at pizza shops a few blocks away. One night, I remember she had texted me asking if I wanted to do something. This was before everyone had unlimited cell phone plans. I had the Nokia that was basically a brick, and since I had to pay for minutes we used to text, and if it was short, we could get away with not having to open it and therefore being charged these 0.5 per minute. She told me she had a fight with her mum and felt like going out and smoking some weed. I had work and couldn't be done until we closed up until 1 AM. Since I needed gas money, I told her that I couldn't blow off work, but I might come out afterwards. She sighed and said okay, and to text her when I was done at work to see if she was still out because she didn't decide what she was going to do yet. At 1:15, I texted her but didn't get a reply. No big deal. I thought she probably was asleep, so Saturday I text her. Nothing. Sunday, nothing. Again, I thought she was probably grounded. That's why she was mad to begin with. She was grounded and went out and got grounded again. Monday I came into school, and I hear the teachers make an announcement. Sorry to inform you, but Deanna is missing. Her family has reported her missing after she left and went out and never came home. The teacher said this in a despondent tone, and my stomach dropped. My fingers tingled. I couldn't believe it. Apparently that night she ended up hanging out with a guy who she met working at the pizza shop. Everything was going great. She was a beautiful girl. She was a model, so we know what he was thinking. We aren't exactly sure in what order everything went down, but she was drugged, raped, and strangled. Then her vile murderer decided to cut up her body into pieces, put her into a steel drum, and light her on fire. I think about that night over and over again. Should I have gone? Would I have really made any difference? Or would he have just killed us both? Her father was an FBI agent, so it truly goes to show that if someone is evil and wants to kill you, then nothing, and I mean not a thing, will get in their way. So Lamar Hames, Please, let's not meet. I used to work at a gas station. I was a third shift worker. For the most part, it was an okay job. Things were slow, and I could do whatever I wanted. Honestly, it was rare for anyone to come in, and if they did, it was usually for only a pack of cigarettes or something. I had been working there for about 6 months, when I had a really strange experience. This teenager came into the store. He was really dirty looking and tired. He came to me asking, "Have you seen my shoes? I lost my shoes." I had to look down, and indeed, he was standing in dirty socks. I told him no. Then I kept insisting that I was absolutely sure, and that I'd let him know if we ever found them. The guy just stood there for a few moments staring at me. His eyes wouldn't go in and out of focus as he did. I was sure that he was either on drugs or that he had some kind of mental deficiency. I asked him if there was anything I could do for him, and after staring at the world swaying back and forth a little, he asked me if he could use the restroom. I didn't really want him in the store, but hey, the guy was walking around in his socks without shoes. The least I could do was let him use the restroom. I gave him the key, which was linked to a block of wood. I pointed him out at the back of the store, and he went and got into the bathroom. I'd like to say that this is where things got weird, but hell, it's been weird since the guy came to this place. I waited for him to come out the bathroom. 5 minutes went by, then 10, then 20, a half hour, and soon an entire hour had passed, and the guy in his socks was still in the bathroom stall. I wondered what I could do. I thought he might have been shooting up or something, and I figured the best thing to do would be to call the police. But then, what if I was wrong? So I went over and knocked on the bathroom door. No answer. I knock again. I then called the guy, but there was no answer. Finally, I decided to just open the doorknob. I thought maybe if I pushed the old door it would, and that wasn't necessary at all. He hadn't locked the door. I opened up the door and was surprised that he wasn't in there at all. There was no way he could have gotten out the bathroom. There was no other door, and there were no windows. But he wasn't there, and the key was laying right on the sink. The key that I gave the guy in socks. And strangely enough, there were a pair of shoes sitting beside the toilet. I didn't know what to do. I just looked at the key and put it back. And after that experience, I just quit of working at the gas station. It was way too freaky. I used to drink at a certain pub in Glasgow and go on to a nightclub after. The pub was populated by bikers and other heavy music fans, and this one guy that wore pale blue jeans and a white iron shirt totally didn't fit in. Now I'm an antisocial girl, so I would sit in the pub with a book. I liked a pint, music, and having people around. I just didn't like talking. White shirt man kept trying. He would nod at me whenever I looked up, try to buy me a drink. I went to the bar several times and he sat at my table trying to start a conversation. And apparently saying sorry I'm not interested didn't mean a thing to him. A few days later I'm back, and I was really dressed up because I felt like it. Creepy white shirt guy kept trying to catch my eye. When I walked around to the nightclub, he followed me persistently trying to get my attention. All night this dickhead followed me. The club had 3 floors and was packed, but this guy would even wait outside the loos if I went in. One friend I left my drink with later admitted he put it down on the bar for a while. After a while I started feeling odd. Very odd. I was dizzy, sweating, shaking, and decided I must be coming down with something, and headed home. I don't remember going down the stairs, but apparently White Shirt Guy followed me. However, the bouncer stopped the creep getting to me when he tried saying I had too much to drink. I used to run pubs. The bouncer knew that I knew my limits, and that I wasn't drunk. I was ill. White Shirt Guy got pushy, and Dal the bouncer ended up pinning him against a wall. However, during this time I wandered off. One street behind the club is the red light district. No idea how I got there, but I was spotted there hours later, walking up the main road by my home. My skirt was ripped. I had no shoes, bag or coat. A biker friend of mine, who is also a cab driver, recognized my tattoos from the back and stopped to see if I was okay. He instantly realized I wasn't, got me in his cab, and phoned the nearby hospital to say he was bringing me in. 3 days later I finally woke up, and made enough sense to figure out what happened. My drink had been spiked with ketamine, a borderline dangerous dose. The cab driver talked to Dal the bouncer, and between them they figured out what happened. The cab driver and his friends tracked down the white shirt creep and gave him a kicking. Then the railway lads heard about it as well, and they gave him a kicking too. He was barred from the club and bar for life. It was an awfully long time before I ever went out again. I grew up in a ranch-style house in a rural SoCal. I was still living at home whilst going to college, partially because of cost, and partially because my mum needed assistance because of her health. My dad was out of town on business often, so it would be up to me to hold the fort. Around 2:30 AM one night, I wake up, intensely on edge, with the sinking feeling that something is in the house. It was a full moon, and the Santa Ana winds were blowing exceptionally hard. I sat up and listened closely for over a minute, but I could only hear the rustling of leaves outside. I couldn't hear anything inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finally mustered the courage to get up and investigate. I quietly opened my bedroom door and crept down the hallway, navigating only by the available moonlight. As I reached the end of the hall, I could hear the front door was open and slowly banging against a metal umbrella stand when I was hit by the most putrid smell. At this point, the adrenaline has me close to puking. It took all my strength to turn around the corner to get to the door. I slam the door and start turning on every light I can find and begin looking around. My heart is pounding out my chest as I go from room to room checking for an intruder. As I enter the dining room, I discover the source of the smell. Right in the middle of a rather expensive rug is what I later learned to be a pile of partially digested figs. It turns out a coyote had gorged himself on dropped figs from our orchard and happened across the door opened by the wind. It entered the house and marked its newfound digs and likely fled when it heard me enter my bedroom. Nonetheless, the whole experience was very tense and absolutely terrifying. I live in a small town, and lately there's been a lot of activities trying to bring the community together. One of these is rock hunting, where everyone paints rocks and hides them around town, and when you find them, you post about it and then rehide it, sort of like geocaching. A group of friends and I decided to go on a late night walk. There were 5 of us. The other girl, Mel, and I decided to start rock hunting just for the hell of it. The guys were all taking their time behind us, and of course Mel and I were on a mission, so we get carried on our way. We cross the bridge in town, and one side is significantly more lit than the other, so when we got to the other side, it was practically pitch black, with only our phones to light us. The guys eventually made their way over, but strayed way too far, distracted by whatever and just goofing off. Mel and I wandered down the path. It had flower gardens on both sides where people would just hide rocks, and in the daytime it was absolutely beautiful looking. We didn't realize it until we were probably a couple of blocks away that we couldn't hear the guys anymore, and we could no longer see the bridge. I got a very uneasy feeling out of nowhere, and made a comment that we should go back to get the guys. They were probably wondering where we were. I saw Mel bent over in the dim glow of my phone, and shined my light over, asking her if she'd found a rock. I shit you not. There was a man standing right behind her, just staring in my direction. If she had been standing up straight, he would have been breathing down her neck. And she had absolutely no idea. I just held eye contact and told her that we needed to go. I don't know if she noticed the change in my voice, but she grabbed the rock and immediately headed my way, not once looking back or noticing him. As she headed my way, I could see the light reflecting off his eyes. I don't even think he blinked. It was just this weird vacant stare. I glanced down and saw his fists were balled, and I got this very bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't want to freak her out, but I was walking away at an abnormally fast pace, and I think she got the idea something was up. We didn't say anything until the guys were back in sight at the bridge, and I laid all that I had just seen upon them. One of the guys just tried to pass it off as maybe he was just waiting for you to get out of the way, whilst the others started going on how that guy better not think twice about messing with his girls, and shouting out obscenities and threats in Spanish, which were all cut short by a loud sigh. We stopped and watched the same man who had been practically standing on top of Mel drop down on all fours and run across the bridge like some weird humanoid creature. He had followed us back to the guys. We didn't even know. We hadn't heard his footsteps or breathing or anything. He followed us as silently as he had appeared originally, and took off like a bat out of hell when he realized we weren't alone. I don't know if it were my friend's threats or the fact that Mel and I were not on our own, but I'm thankful that someone got that creep away from us. You don't just follow someone silently through the dark if you have the best of intentions in your mind, now do you? No more rock hunting for me at night. Around 10 years ago, a few of my friends decided to go to Cedar Point. Everything was fine, right up until riding the power tower. We all sat down in the seats and everything seemed fine. I used to live near Geauga Lake in the 90s, so I rode these types of rides often. I sit down and start speaking with my friends, and push down the hydraulic metal restraint thing. Everything seemed fine, and we started moving in the air. About halfway up, I noticed that the hydraulic metal restraint never locked, and halfway up in the air, my friends noticed that the seatbelt could easily become unattached. We all start screaming, but this being a ride, the operator either doesn't hear us or doesn't care, because everyone screams on rides. I came to realize that I could die, and did the only thing I could in this situation. I put all my strength in holding the bars to my chest whilst the ride is dropping to the ground, which wasn't too bad until the ride shot you back up into the air. I was dangerously close to not being able to hold on anymore, but I managed and the ride ended. After the ride stopped, I couldn't move, and my friend said I was completely white-faced. Then I noticed blood dripping from my hands. I was squeezing my hands so tightly that my fingernails dug into my skin. and 10 years later, I'm still shaking just saying this. Sadly, I've not been back there since. It's actually not the first time something scary like that has happened to me. It's just the worst one. The other one happened when I was much younger and involved Geauga Lake. Not exactly a ride, but a swimming pool type thing called The Wave. They removed or changed it because people were getting hurt and almost drowning left, right and centre. The problem was that they allowed inner tubes, and on a busy day it would be nothing but rafts. The old design was one huge wave that came every 5 to 10 minutes, so you would likely be pushed underwater. And if there would be too many rafts in your general area, it could be very hard for you to come up and breathe again. If you're a kid trying to push a 300-pound person off a raft, it's almost impossible. The combination of these things happening to me have made theme parks perpetually unappealing. I was in 8th grade at the time. In the classroom pretty close to ours, one kid had brought a gun with him. Thinking that it was a replica, he was playing around with it and quietly showing it off to his friends in the middle of the classroom. Apparently the professor was preparing an experiment for chemistry class and was not supervising them. As the teacher went back into the room, the boy was pretty hysterical and grabbed the gun from his friend. In the process, he accidentally pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the flask the teacher was holding and went into his arm. We just heard the bullet exploding the glass and the scream of agony that followed. Our teacher told us to be quiet and went outside the room to check what happened in the chemistry lab. We really were silent, dead silent, which is pretty surprising in a class full of 14-year-olds. We were all in fear of what happened and what was about to happen. We had to stay in the classroom, but everyone was gathered around the windows when an ambulance and 2 police cars arrived. The teacher had 2 surgeries and suffered from chemical burns. The boy got suspended. I never heard from him again. Fortunately, no one lost their life. None of us ever forgot and kept the lesson from the incident. This may sound crazy, but here it goes. In college, my then boyfriend and I lived in an old house near campus. The house always kind of gave off a little bit of a creepy vibe, but nothing ominous. After living there for about a year, I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Things I couldn't explain, but would convince myself weren't there at all. One day, I was walking through the living room, and I could have sworn I saw a youngish guy with long hair, wearing jeans and a bandana, sitting on my couch. When I looked again, he was gone. Shortly thereafter, the boyfriend's things started getting messed with. He left a stack of magazines on the bed whilst he went for a shower, and when he came back, they were spread out all across the bed. Not like the stack had just fallen over, but arranged in a grid. Another time in the shower, the water turned suddenly cold. He reached down to turn on the hot water, only to find that the hot water was completely turned off. He started to feel creeped out, but I never got a bad feeling, despite the things I'd seen. I joked that we had a ghost, the bandana hippie guy I saw on the couch, and that he had a crush on me. One night, my boyfriend and I were cooking dinner together. He came up behind me at the stove and started kissing my neck. I joked, "Be careful, Jed," as in the ghost guy, "isn't going to like you doing that." He laughed and says out loud, "Sorry Jed, you can't have her, she's mine." No sooner had the words left his mouth There was a huge crash in the room next to us. We go to the living room shocked, to inspect, and find that the glass door to our entertainment center had been completely shattered. Pieces of glass were flung all over the room, as if the glass had been hit by something hard. After that, no more weird things happened, and no more creepy feelings nor odd occurrences. I truly wonder, did we break a ghost's heart? Just let me start off with a bit of background info. At the time that this occurred, I was in a nursing school and struggling to get by. My dad killed himself when I was little, and my mother turned to alcohol after that, so I didn't get much help there. But I was determined to get my degree and have a stable life for myself. I lived in a really crappy ghetto apartment in the scariest part of town. I'm talking gunshots at least once a week, needles on the sidewalk, and the random hours required for clinicals made it hard to hold down a good job. Plus, I didn't have any transportation besides my bike, which was on its last legs. Long story short, I was having a very hard time and looking for any way to make money. Hugh Jane. She was a good friend of mine who I'd known since freshman year. She'd noticed my situation and told me that she was making $200+ a night at a local strip club. This got my attention, as that was a lot of money. She said the club had a no-touching policy and the guys literally threw money at you. I made the decision to just go with it and went with her one night to check it out. I was graduating in less than a year anyway. Why not? Jane stayed by my side the entire night. I felt safe. No one touched me and no one harassed me. And I made over $300. I was ecstatic. The best part was that I chose my own hours and I could make sure work didn't interfere with school. We went a few more times together before she left to visit her family for spring break. And she left me with explicit instructions that if I decided to go to work, I was to take a cab, call her when I left work, and call her when I got there, and text her every hour, and call her when I was leaving. This seemed like overkill to me, but I agreed. I finished all my classwork early one night, and thought, since it was spring break in a big city, I could probably earn a few $100s extra. I called a cab, called Jane, and went to work. Everything was going fine. I was doing a great job and making more money than I ever had. I was then approached by a girl who I'd seen there before. She introduced herself as Asia, but none of us went by our real names. She talked to me for a bit and asked me where I lived. This sent off tiny alarm bells, but I figured that she was just being friendly, and named another shitty apartment complex near mine. She told me she was looking for a chill roommate and asked if I'd be interested. I was obviously taken aback, but I was dying to get out of my scary place. I asked her how much the rent was, and she said the guy who owned the duplex wasn't charging students as long as they were working. This should have set off even more alarm bells, since I didn't tell Asia that I was a student, but I completely missed that at the time. I was a little cautious, but definitely interested. She told me that she'd take me by the place if I wanted after the club had closed, and I thought there'd be no harm in looking. I called Jane and told her about the situation. She became very quiet and asked me what the girl's name was. I told her, and she responded that I needed to call a cab now and get home now. I was pissed. She was ruining this for me until she explained that Asia was a known prostitute. And long story short, I would have gotten to live there, but as a sex slave. She didn't want me as her roommate. She wanted to bring me back to her pimp. I called a cab and hid in the back until I got there. I heard Asia was looking for me, but I didn't come out. And as soon as I got the text that the cab was there, I ran to the back door and sprinted out of it. I looked back to see the commotion that I had caused, Asia was still looking for me, and a large man turned in the direction. I never worked there again, and graduated a few months later. I now live in a good apartment with a great job at the ER, but I shudder to think what could have happened that night. I worked in a very old riverside hotel in England when I was younger. The place was 17th century, but there'd been a building of sorts on that spot for far, far longer. We'd always understood it was haunted. There were reports of voices and things that were moved regularly. People would complain that their rooms were cold even when the heating was on. I myself had been tapped on the shoulder more than once by nothing. We all felt that there were at least one female spirit there. It had been a brothel in the 1800s, so it made sense. My job was to make up the beds and clean the rooms. I was quite young at the time, around 18, so I used to sometimes get unwanted attention from perverted old men. One time, this man in his 40s kept saying things to me. I was so uncomfortable, but he was booked in for a week, and so I felt too shy to say anything to the manager. On his third day, he'd gone out very early, and I made up his room, put clean towels in, and just as I was leaving, I said something like, "Bloody old perv, I hope you get sick." And that night, long after I'd gone home, he came down to reception at around 11 p.m. and complained to the night manager there that there was a stink in his room and that it was making him feel very unwell. The manager went up to his room and it just reeked of vomit. He looked under the bed and in the cupboards to see if the man had thrown up there and hidden it, but no traces were found. He moved the man to another, not so nice room and went back downstairs. Half an hour later, the man was back. He said that the room smelled of vomit as well. The manager just ended up spraying air freshener in the room, as there was nowhere else to put the man. He left in the morning and got a refund. When they told me what had happened, I felt that our female prostitute ghost had heard what I said about him getting sick, and had literally brought him sick in the form of that smell. One evening back when I was in high school, my parents left me with the house alone for one evening. No biggie. I've been home alone at night plenty of times, so I'm watching TV until I decide to hit the sack. As I'm turning off the lights and making my way towards my bedroom, I reach the hallway, leading to both my room and my sister's room. As soon as I hit the switch behind me to turn off the lights to my kitchen downstairs and turn back towards my bedroom, I see a shadow figure in front of me at the end of the hall. It's about 6 feet tall. I'm staring at it in complete shock for about 3 to 4 seconds, and when I try to rub my eyes to make sure I'm not just seeing things, the figure darts off into my sister's room, way faster than any human can go. I felt like I was zapped, and I fell to my knees out of shock briefly. I quickly got up though to look for my dog, to make sure he was okay, and if he detected this, because under any other circumstance, if someone got within 10 feet of our house, my dog would alert everyone immediately by barking incessantly. However, he was in my parents' bedroom, which is on the opposite corner of the house to where I'd seen this figure, and his eyes looked worried. So I shut the door, locked it, and closed my eyes, but I barely managed to sleep in my parents' room that night. I know people have spoken about seeing shadowy figures before in paranormal investigations, and I know others say sometimes you just see things when you're tired. I know what I saw. It looked real. I haven't seen the figure since, but that hallway still feels kind of creepy to this day. Back in my late teens in Dublin, Ireland, I used to head to a particular nightclub every single week and got to know most of the regulars in there, to the point where I could sit at any table and know at least a few people. One night I was introduced to a new woman that no one really knew very well. I said hello and made very short and polite conversation, and then went about my time dancing and drinking as normal. Nothing much of note happened during my time at the club. At the end of my night though, I left a little bit earlier than my friends, because I live really far away and outside of the city. I got a taxi home and got to bed, falling into a deep slumber. I need to point out that I don't actually drink very much, and there was no way in hell I was drunk when this happened. I woke up in the morning, sunlight streaming through the room, and I immediately knew something was wrong. There was too much weight on the bed. I spun and looked down to the end of the room, and there, sat on the end of the bed, was the woman from the night before, staring at me wide-eyed, with utter devotion and a weird smile. It was absolutely horrible. I had no idea what to say, and so I said nothing. I was so weirded out by her expression and the whole bizarre nature of the situation. I was dumbstruck. It wasn't a lustful look. It was spooky, obsessive, and insane looking. I know for a lot of guys the idea of having some random woman appear in their bedroom might be a thrill, but this was nothing like that. It was scary, plain and simple. I got up, got dressed, summoned a bit of courage, turned to her and said, "You're leaving. Now," and essentially marched her out the house, telling her that buses leave from the end of the road every half an hour. She left without a word. From talking to my friends and family, I pieced together what happened. After I left the nightclub, she had tried to catch up with me but instead had lost me. She went back, asked around until someone told her the rough area in which I lived, and got a taxi there. She then started knocking on random doors, waking up neighbours, and eventually one of them told them exactly where I lived. She then knocked on my door, and my sister came down to answer. She lied to her, saying that I had been expecting her. My sister was pissed off because she was woken up, but let her in. From there she got into my room and sat there for God knows how long, silently watching me. As it turns out, nobody from the club knew her at all, but we all assumed someone else must have known her. What really spooks me though, is that if she had wanted to hurt me for whatever reason, she'd easily found her way right into my family home and into my bedroom. I'm shuddering just thinking about it. When I was 19, my parents and brother had gone away for the weekend, and I stayed behind. I had had a pretty rough night and was very drunk. I pulled a Britney Spears move and cut off all my long hair, drunkenly thinking to reinvent myself because I was moving away for university the following week. When I finished rinsing the freshly cut hair off my neck in the shower, I left the bathroom to find a note in the hallway that said, "I was going to leave you a note, but I see that you're here." I'd left my towel in my room, so I was walking around naked, as I thought that I was alone. But then I opened my door to my room, and there was a guy with his hair in his face standing in the middle of the room grinning at me. I freaked out and screamed bloody murder, as one tends to do when they're a naked 19-year-old girl entering to find an unexpected stranger in their home at 2:30 AM, until I recognized him. It was the boy I had dated in my first year of high school 3 years ago. for about 2 weeks, until he ran away from home. Turns out that he'd heard I was moving away, and just wanted to talk. He didn't hurt nor threaten me in any way, other than breaking into my house in the middle of the night. He handed me some clothes from my bed, and we chatted, until he eventually left. I found out 2 years later that he had been institutionalized for schizophrenia. I used to work in a hotel part-time for a while, and there were always rumors about it being haunted. It was an old building that had changed hands many times, but had been a hotel for years, and now it's a big brand hotel. Anyway, there was this one floor none of the staff liked going to in particular at night. Customers often complained that they could hear banging on the walls and children messing around in the hallways. But when we went to check, we never found anyone or anything. It was quite common that when someone was staying next to an empty room, they'd hear banging from that room, freak out, and request a change. I had a couple of spooky occurrences whilst on that floor. I went into a room that had just been cleaned, since I was putting updated leaflets and menus out, and then I heard the shower running. I walked in and turned it off, thinking it was a bit odd, but perhaps the cleaners accidentally knocked it and left it on. But surely they'd have heard it running full blast. As I was doing that, one of the pictures off the wall fell off, and I come in to this picture smashed on the floor and had to call somebody to clean it up and get it off the carpet. And I swear, it looked like some small footprints were coming from the shower to the bed near where the picture fell off. I noped out of there. I heard the sound of footsteps many times and once heard a child's laughter, but I couldn't trace the source. It sounded like someone was in the same hallway, but nobody was around and it was very late. One of my friends who used to work there at the time said she was in the kitchen and she saw a woman in the mirror dressed in old clothes. Between August 2012 and June 2013, I was 20, and my boyfriend Ryan was living abroad in Trieste, Italy as a teacher. We're both from New England, and I was unfortunately stuck at home from my junior year of college. 10 months is a long time to be in a long-distance relationship for. So, for Christmas, my parents told me I could go visit Ryan over his February holidays, which fell on his birthday and Valentine's Day. In short, it was perfect. When the time came, I sat at the airport and sent Ryan a quick goodbye and happy birthday via text message, as I knew that I wouldn't have service on the flight or when I got to Europe. He wasn't able to meet me at the airport because of work, so he texted me the directions about what to do when I landed in Trieste. The directions went something like this: when you land, go out to the buses. Get on the C bus and take it for about 45 minutes. At the end, you'll be at a train station, and I'll meet you there. It wouldn't hurt to get a map or ask someone for directions if they speak English, but if you follow my directions, you should have no problem. This all seemed pretty straightforward, but to me, I was sitting on a bus. I couldn't help but feel like I'd done something wrong. You know how it is. You're helpless and you always assume the worst. And I was pretty helpless in a foreign country with little knowledge of the language and no travelling companions. So naturally I was worried. I decided to try and communicate with the woman next to me just to calm my nerves. Scusi, inglese? Parlare inglese? She made a face and held up a finger to show me she spoke a little English. Oh, grazie. I'm looking for the train station. Stazione treno? Dove? I pulled out the map I got at the airport and pointed to the train station. She smiled immediately. Si, vengo con me, which I'm pretty sure meant come with me. And even if it didn't, she seemed to know where I wanted to go, and after viewing the map, how could she not? About 15 or 20 minutes into the ride, the bus stops in a really sketchy looking part of the city. The woman stood up and made a come here gesture with her hands. I looked around at all the buildings outside and didn't see a train station anywhere. Ryan had been adamant that I wouldn't miss it, and I'd only been on the bus for half the time he said it would be. Alarm bells started going off in my head. This woman was being so insistent, yet she knew exactly where I wanted to go because I'd shown her on the map, and this clearly wasn't it. Then she grabbed my arm and tried pulling me out of my seat. "I'm not having any of this," I said. No grazie, ciao, and waved goodbye. She looked really irritated, but she seemed to give up. I heard her mutter something I couldn't understand in Italian, and that's when 5 dudes stood up from all different parts of the bus and got off with her. The 6 of them were clearly together, yet she'd sat next to me, and had not once talked to any one of them during the course of the 20-minute bus ride. I was a little more than creeped out, but I made it to the bus stop without any further incident, and about half-hour later, I mentioned my experience to Ryan, and the 2 of us laughed it off, joking that it could have ended up like the girl from Taken. I may have been overreacting, but sometimes I really wonder. Italy, Trieste in particular, is known for human trafficking. A huge ring was just busted in May of last year. I feel that lonely young foreign travellers are probably pretty easy prey for them, and luring a young girl with a woman, and then using strong men to take her, doesn't seem that far out of the realm of possibility. Bad people or not, it was pretty scary for me, and I'm glad I had enough sense to stay on the bus. Who knows where I'd be now? So sketchy Italian lady and friends, let's not meet again. A couple of years ago, I lived in a duplex on a busy road, pretty much right on the divide between State University territory and a not so great part of town. We got a decent amount of foot traffic, in part because of the university. My duplex was on the corner, facing the side street. I was in the half further away from the busy road, and my front door was inside of the fenced backyard. I lived alone with my dog and my cats. On the other side of the duplex, I only met Jake and his brother, but I think their parents lived there as well. One day I get home from work at around 4:30, and as soon as I get in, there's a knock. I look at the peephole and it's Jake. I'm feeling apprehensive because we've spoken like twice ever, and I can't imagine what he's about to say to me. I open the door, and he looks apprehensive too. He asks me if I've looked in my kitchen closet. I say no, because that's where the water heater is, and a shelf to keep my holiday decorations. But I go in and I open it, and there is a huge hole in the wall. Drywall and stuff all over the floor, and I can see Jake's family living room through it. So Jake tells me that right before I got home. They got home as well, and they had surprised a burglar who had broken in on their side. The burglar freaked out, grabbed a knife, and proceeded to try and smash through their living room wall with a knife to escape through my apartment. But as soon as my dog heard the commotion, she started barking like crazy. She sounded so scary. He couldn't even see her because the closet door was shut, so he basically changed his mind and just ran past the neighbors and out the door. He didn't even have time to steal anything, and I'd basically just missed this. But a few days later, I came home around 4:30 p.m, surprised. Someone was in my backyard trying to break the window to get in. My half of the house didn't have any windows in the backyard, so if he had succeeded, he would have just ended up in Jake's bedroom. The guy ran out of the gate right past me carrying a backpack and took off down the road. I'm quite convinced it was the same guy. So guy that brazenly tried to break into my house in broad daylight? Let's not meet again. This story occurred when I was very young, so I don't recall it happening, and only learnt of it when my mother brought it up a year or two back, as we were reminiscing of the past. My family and I come from Japan, and the paranormal encounter occurred back in our home there. In Japan, we have this tradition where after a person returns to a funeral, whoever stays behind at the house has to throw salt on that person before they can enter the house again. This tradition is believed to prevent the spirits of the one who has died from following you into your home. At the time, my great-grandfather had passed away, and my mother and I stayed behind at the house, whilst my father went to attend the funeral. I was at the age where I didn't really understand the concept of death at all, and I had no idea that I would never be able to see my great-grandfather again. However, upon my father's return, I went to go open the door for him and said, "Mama, Papa, look, Grandpa's back." This brought a puzzled expression upon both my mother and my father, and they brushed it off for a second, until they realized that I was talking to air, as if I was speaking to my great-grandfather. It wasn't anything particularly menacing, but it was quite creepy. Just typical things about my day, which toys I'd played with, what I ate, and so forth. But in a manner as though I were responding to questions, and someone was asking them. After a few more moments of this, my parents snapped out of the shock, threw salt at both the door and my father, and proceeded to take me upstairs. Honestly, I feel a bit bitter that out of all my childhood memories in Japan, this is the one I can't recall. I hope you passed on well to the other side, great-grandfather. This happened around 8 years ago. I didn't know the victim personally, but he was a bit of a loner. He came into my high school and shot himself midday. A lot of people who had been out there on the soccer field witnessed it. Immediately afterwards, we were terrified. I went to a really large school, and we practiced lockdown drills all the time, several times a month at least. We went into lockdown. They refused to tell us what was going on, and our phones didn't really help much because it was too early for the news stations to make any reports yet. We all thought that someone had been going around on a shooting spree in our school. It turns out that everyone else found out about it before we did, and we were locked in the classrooms for hours. My mum picked me up later that day crying. The news had reported that someone had been shot, but they weren't sure who it was, and I'm not sure my parents knew it was a suicide. There were ambulances and police cars covering the parking lot, and news helicopters flying overhead. We had a few days off school and eventually went back. They had blocked off the patio outside where he'd shot himself. It was connected to the cafeteria, and you could still see where the bloodstains were on the cement, even though it had been washed away. It was a very somber atmosphere. Lots of crying, lots of rumours. Some people said that he even had a bunch of magazines in his backpack, ready to shoot up the school. Some people say they saw him drop to the ground. It was very eye-opening. We had school assemblies and grief counselling for ages. They became much stricter and safety-wise, and started bringing police dogs out more often to sniff around the parking lot and lockers for evidence of gunpowder. Things got back to normal, but this really put things in perspective. I didn't know the guy, but this dude had friends, had family. People can be really good at hiding things. Be careful what you say to people. Don't be afraid to support someone or just offer a hug or an ear to someone who's feeling down. Who knows who's out there, suffering, depressed, or just needing a friend. I count myself lucky. I don't know what his intentions were that day, if he just thought he couldn't go through with the shooting and decided to take his own life instead. I still wish though that I could have made a difference in this poor kid's life. I'm sorry. This story has stuck with me for a long time. I was on break. The park was hot, around 94 degrees with the humidity squeezing my neck. The park was packed, with walking room no better than rush hour traffic. My friend was the park medic who had only been working there for about 4 months. Her name was Shelley. Whilst we were talking, an alarm came in over the radio, stating that a guest had passed out next to her child. She immediately left our conversation and took off running. Next time I saw her, she was clocking out, and she was walking to her car crying. I asked her what was wrong, and she let the waterworks go. She looked up and told me what really happened. An old lady came to the park with her granddaughter. The grandmother was waiting on a bench whilst her granddaughter played in the splash zone. The grandmother collapsed, and the granddaughter runs over just as the woman starts bleeding from her eyes, nose and mouth. Shelley is there moments later, and the managers were by her side in a panic. Shelley immediately starts trying to check her vitals as the girl grabs her arm and begs her not to let her grandma die. The grandmother died shortly after, and Shelley quit that same day.